August 8, 1941. The sun rose hot and pale over the Ukrainian steppe near Biliaivka, a small village on the approaches to Odessa, casting long shadows across fields that had been peaceful farmland just weeks before. Now they were scarred with fresh earthworks, littered with spent shell casings, and stained with the blood of soldiers from two nations locked in a war that would consume millions. In a carefully concealed position overlooking a dirt road, a young woman lay perfectly still, her eye pressed to the scope of a Mosin-Nagant rifle she had received just days earlier from a dying comrade. Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She was 25 years old, a university student who had been studying history in Kiev when the world exploded around her. She had never killed anyone before. That was about to change. Through the scope, she watched two German officers emerge from a vehicle approximately 400 meters away. They were confident, unhurried, examining maps and pointing toward Soviet positions. They did not know they were being watched. Lyudmila steadied her breathing, calculated the distance and windage with the precision she had learned as a girl at the shooting club in Kiev, and squeezed the trigger. The first officer dropped. Before the second could react or take cover, she had cycled the bolt and fired again. He fell beside his companion. In the space of seconds, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had become a combat sniper, and the legend of Lady Death had begun its terrible bloom. To understand how a young woman came to lie in the dirt with a rifle in her hands, hunting human beings with clinical precision, we must go back 15 years to a childhood that seemed destined for anything but war. Lyudmila Mikhailovna Belova was born on July 12, 1916, in the small Ukrainian town of Biliaivka, during the chaos of the First World War and the twilight of the Russian Empire. Her father, Mikhail Belov, was a Communist Party member who had served in the Red Army. Her mother, Elena, worked to keep their family together through revolution, civil war, and the tumultuous birth of the Soviet Union. By all accounts, Lyudmila was not a quiet or obedient child. She was what her neighbors called a tomboy, unruly in the classroom, determined never to be outdone by boys her age. She possessed a fierce independence and an iron will that would serve her well in the years to come, though no one could have imagined how severely those qualities would be tested. When Lyudmila was 14 years old, her family relocated to Kiev, the ancient capital of Ukraine, where she found work as a metal grinder in the Kiev Arsenal factory, a munitions plant. It was hard, dangerous work, but it paid, and it allowed her to contribute to her family and pursue her education at night school. Like many young people in the Soviet Union during the 1930s, Lyudmila participated in OSOAVIAKHIM, a paramilitary sporting organization that trained Soviet youth in weapons handling, marksmanship, parachuting, and military discipline. It was at one of these youth clubs that Lyudmila's life took a decisive turn. A neighbor boy had been boasting about his exploits at a local shooting range, declaring himself the best shot among the young people in their district. Lyudmila, never one to let a challenge go unanswered, set out to prove that a girl could shoot just as well as any boy. She joined a shooting club and discovered something remarkable. She had a natural gift for marksmanship. The rifle felt right in her hands. The discipline of breath control, the mathematics of trajectory and wind, the stillness required before the shot, all of it came naturally to her. She practiced relentlessly, and soon she was not merely as good as the boys. She was better. At 16, Lyudmila married a doctor named Alexei Pavlichenko and gave birth to a son. The marriage was brief. Lyudmila's ambitions and desire for education did not fit within the traditional domestic role expected of young wives, and the marriage ended. She returned to her parents' home, where she juggled the responsibilities of single motherhood, household chores, night school, and factory work, an exhausting schedule that would have broken someone with less determination. But Lyudmila was not easily broken. She enrolled at Kiev University to study history, pursuing her education with the same fierce focus she had brought to shooting. She continued her marksmanship training, even attending a sniper school while completing her university coursework. She was building a life, a future. And then, on June 22, 1941, that future was set on fire. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union, commenced in the pre-dawn hours of that Sunday morning. 3 million Axis soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft, smashed across the Soviet border along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It was the largest invasion force in human history, and its objective was the complete destruction of the Soviet Union and the enslavement of its people. The initial German assault achieved complete surprise, and Soviet forces reeled backward under the onslaught, suffering catastrophic losses in men and material. Cities burned. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Millions of civilians fled eastward, or found themselves trapped behind rapidly advancing German lines. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was in her 4th year at Kiev University when the war began. She was 24 years old, with a young son, a degree within reach, and every reason to seek safety in evacuation. Instead, she did something that astonished the recruiting officials in Odessa. She presented herself at the recruitment office and demanded to join the infantry. Not the medical corps, not a support unit, the infantry as a combat soldier. The male registrar looked at this young woman and tried to steer her toward nursing. It was the expected path for women in the military, honorable, necessary work, but safely behind the lines. Lyudmila refused. She had her marksmanship certificates from her years of shooting club participation and sniper school training. She insisted that she could fight, that she would fight. The recruiter, perhaps because the situation was desperate and the Red Army needed every capable soldier, or perhaps because he recognized the steel in her eyes, relented. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was accepted into the Red Army and assigned to the 25th Rifle Division. She became one of approximately 2,000 women who would serve as snipers in the Soviet military during the Great Patriotic War, a number that would be reduced to only 500 survivors by war's end. When Lyudmila arrived at the front lines near Odessa in late July 1941, she carried nothing but her determination and a single RGD-33 hand grenade. There were severe weapons shortages in the early weeks of the war, and like many new arrivals, she was initially assigned to dig trenches and communication routes rather than engage in combat. It must have been frustrating for a trained sniper to spend her days with a shovel instead of a rifle, but the Red Army was improvising desperately in those chaotic weeks, trying to build defensive positions that might slow the seemingly unstoppable German advance. Then, in mid-July, a comrade near her was severely wounded by shrapnel from an artillery round. As he lay bleeding, perhaps knowing he would not survive, he handed Lyudmila his Mosin-Nagant Model 1891 bolt-action rifle, the standard Soviet infantry weapon. It was a practical rifle, rugged and reliable, capable of accuracy at long ranges in the hands of a skilled marksman. Lyudmila finally had her weapon. Now she needed her opportunity. That opportunity came on August 8, 1941, near the village of Biliaivka, and we have returned to where our story began. Those 2 German officers, confident in their maps and their advance, became the first entries in a tally that would grow to horrifying proportions. But in that moment, Lyudmila felt no triumph, no satisfaction. She would later recall that killing another human being, even an enemy soldier, was not something that came naturally or easily. It was a violation of something fundamental in the human soul. But the war allowed no room for such considerations. The Germans and their allies were laying siege to her city, her homeland. They would show no mercy to Soviet soldiers or civilians. She could fight or she could surrender to annihilation. She chose to fight. The Battle of Odessa, known to the Soviets as the Defense of Odessa, officially began on August 5, 1941, and would last 73 brutal days. Odessa was a major port city on the Black Sea, strategically vital and symbolically important. The attacking force consisted primarily of the Romanian 4th Army, reinforced by elements of the German 11th Army, 5 infantry divisions, 2 cavalry divisions, 1 motorized brigade, and substantial artillery and air support. They vastly outnumbered the defenders, who consisted of the separate coastal army, 2 rifle divisions and 1 cavalry division, supported by Black Sea Fleet warships that provided naval gunfire. The Soviet defenders numbered perhaps 34,000 combat troops against an Axis force of more than 270,000. By every conventional military calculation, Odessa should have fallen within days. Instead, the Red Army held, and held, and held. The defense of Odessa would become one of the great defensive stands of the early war, buying precious time for the Soviet Union to mobilize its vast reserves and industrial capacity. The fighting was savage, close-quarters combat in streets and buildings, artillery duels, tank battles in the city's outskirts, and constant sniper activity. It was in this crucible that Lyudmila Pavlichenko forged her reputation. Day after day, she moved through the defensive positions, selecting firing positions with care, studying the enemy's movements, waiting with infinite patience for targets to present themselves. She learned to read the battlefield, to anticipate where officers would appear, where machine gun crews would set up, where enemy snipers might be concealed. She learned to remain motionless for hours, ignoring thirst, heat, cold, and fear. She learned to make every shot count, because ammunition was precious and a missed shot could reveal her position and bring down artillery or machine gun fire. By the time October arrived and the Romanian forces finally overran Odessa's defenses, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had been credited with 187 confirmed kills. Each one represented a careful stalk, precise calculation, steady aim, and flawless execution. The Soviet system for confirming sniper kills was rigorous. A second soldier, usually another sniper or a spotter, had to witness and verify each kill, and in many cases, officers required physical evidence or documentation. These were not inflated propaganda figures. They were confirmed, documented eliminations of enemy combatants. In August, she had been promoted to senior sergeant in recognition of her achievements. The shy university student who had arrived with a hand grenade was now a seasoned combat veteran, a killer of extraordinary skill and effectiveness. But the defense of Odessa exacted a terrible personal cost. During the siege, at the age of 25, Lyudmila married again. Her new husband was Alexei Kitsenko, a fellow sniper in her unit. They were kindred spirits, two people who understood the unique psychological burden of sniper warfare, the isolation, the moral weight of taking life with such personal, deliberate intent. Lyudmila would later recall that their brief honeymoon, spent in a trench taking shots at German positions, had a positive effect on her shooting. They were together for only days or perhaps weeks. Sources vary on the exact timeline. What is certain is that Alexei Kitsenko was struck by a mortar shell and mortally wounded. He died from his injuries in a field hospital a few days later. Lyudmila was shattered by his death, falling into a depression from which, by some accounts, she never fully recovered. The war, which had already been a struggle for survival, now became intensely personal. She had lost comrades, friends, and now a husband to the enemy. She returned to her rifle with a cold fury. On October 15, 1941, with Soviet defenses finally collapsing under overwhelming pressure, the Red Army began evacuating Odessa by sea. The Black Sea Fleet's vessels evacuated as many soldiers and civilians as possible, ferrying them to Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, where another desperate defense was being organized. Lyudmila Pavlichenko and the remnants of the 25th Rifle Division were among those withdrawn. As she boarded the evacuation ship, leaving behind a city now occupied by Romanian and German forces, she carried her rifle, her equipment, and a burden of grief that would never fully lift. But she also carried her skills, her experience, and her determination to continue fighting. Sevastopol, an ancient fortress city and the principal base of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, was already under siege when Lyudmila arrived. The city's strategic position on the Crimean Peninsula made it a vital objective for the Germans, who needed to secure Crimea to protect their southern flank and access the oil fields of the Caucasus. The siege of Sevastopol would last 250 days, from October 1941 until July 1942, and it would become one of the most brutal and costly battles of the entire war. The Germans threw everything they had at the city: massive siege artillery, constant aerial bombardment, repeated infantry assaults supported by tanks and flamethrowers. The Soviet defenders fought from fortified positions, from the rubble of destroyed buildings, from tunnels and bunkers, giving up ground only when physically overrun, and then counterattacking to regain lost positions. The casualty rates on both sides were staggering. In Sevastopol, Lyudmila Pavlichenko resumed her deadly work. She was now an experienced sniper, a veteran of months of continuous combat, and her skills had been honed to a razor's edge. She began training other snipers, passing on the techniques and tactics she had learned at such cost. The snipers she trained were credited with killing more than 100 Axis soldiers during the siege. But she also continued her own mission, moving through the devastated city, taking positions in ruins and rubble, stalking her prey with methodical patience. Her confirmed kill count climbed steadily: 200, then 250. By May 1942, Lieutenant Pavlichenko, now promoted again for her extraordinary service, was officially credited with 257 confirmed kills. She had become a legend within the Red Army, a symbol of Soviet resistance and determination. As her reputation grew, so did the danger she faced. German intelligence became aware of her existence and her effectiveness. They began specifically hunting for her, assigning countersnipers to find and eliminate the Soviet marksman who was killing their officers and soldiers with such regularity. This led to some of the most dangerous missions of Lyudmila's career: countersniper duels, deadly games of hide-and-seek played with high-powered rifles at ranges of hundreds of meters. These were not quick engagements. A sniper duel could last hours, or even days, as each combatant sought to outlast the other, waiting for a single careless moment. One tiny mistake that would reveal a position and offer a killing shot. Lyudmila fought 36 such duels during her time at Sevastopol. She won every single one. One duel in particular became legendary among Soviet soldiers. A 3-day engagement with a German sniper that tested every ounce of her skill, patience, and willpower. For 3 days and nights, the two snipers stalked each other through the ruins of Sevastopol, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. They were evenly matched, professionals at the height of their abilities, and each knew that a single error would mean death. They moved positions constantly, never staying in one place long enough for the other to triangulate their location. They used decoys, false movement, sound discipline, every trick in the sniper's arsenal. It was, as Lyudmila later described it, a hunt to the death, one of the most intense experiences of her life. On the third day, exhaustion perhaps dulling his judgment, the German sniper made one move too many, exposed himself for just an instant too long. Lyudmila fired. The duel was over. She had survived again. But survival came at an emotional and psychological cost that is difficult for those who have never experienced combat to comprehend. Lyudmila was killing human beings, enemy soldiers who were trying to kill her and her comrades, but human beings nonetheless. Each kill was a life ended, a person who would never return home, never see their family again. For a university student who had dreamed of becoming a historian or teacher, the transformation into an instrument of death must have been wrenching. She rarely spoke about her emotions during the war, maintaining the stoic, professional demeanor expected of a Soviet soldier. But in her later writings and interviews, hints of the psychological burden emerge. The nightmares, the memories of faces seen through the scope, the weight of so many deaths. The Germans, frustrated and perhaps frightened by her effectiveness, began trying to undermine her morale through psychological warfare. They knew where she was fighting, and they had learned her name through intelligence reports or interrogation of captured Soviet soldiers. Using loudspeakers on the front lines, they broadcast messages directly to her. Initially, they tried bribery. "Lyudmila Pavlichenko, come over to us. We will give you plenty of chocolate and make you a German officer." The offer was absurd, almost comical in its transparency, and Lyudmila ignored it. But as her kill count rose and the German frustration grew, the messages turned darker, more threatening. "You will not escape us," the loudspeakers blared across no man's land. "When we catch you, we will tear you into 309 pieces and scatter them to the winds." Most soldiers would have found such threats terrifying, a promise of torture and death if they were captured. Lyudmila's reaction was characteristically defiant and darkly humorous. She was pleased, she said, that the enemy knew her score accurately. "They even knew my score," she exclaimed to comrades. It meant her work was being noticed, that the Germans feared her enough to try to intimidate her. The threats only hardened her resolve. Behind German lines, she had earned another nickname, the Russian bitch from hell. Within the Red Army and among Soviet civilians learning of her exploits through official reports, she was becoming known as Lady Death. By early June 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had been fighting continuously for nearly a year. She had survived the siege of Odessa, the first months of the siege of Sevastopol, countless close calls with artillery, machine gun fire, mortars, and enemy snipers. Her confirmed kill total had reached 309, including 36 enemy snipers. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally depleted by the unrelenting stress and horror of combat. And then, in June 1942, her luck ran out. During a German artillery barrage, a mortar shell landed near her position. The explosion sent shrapnel slicing through the air in every direction. Lyudmila was struck in the face by multiple pieces of jagged metal. The wounds were serious, painful, and could easily have been fatal. She was evacuated from the front lines, bleeding and in shock, and taken to a field hospital. But Lyudmila Pavlichenko was too valuable to the Soviet war effort to be risked any further on the front lines. Before she had fully recovered from her injuries, the Soviet High Command made a decision. She would not be returning to combat. Instead, she would be evacuated from Sevastopol by submarine and sent to Moscow. For a soldier who had dedicated herself to fighting, who had defined herself by her service on the front lines, this order must have been difficult to accept. But the Red Army had plans for her that went beyond the battlefield. After spending several weeks in a Moscow hospital recovering from her wounds, Lyudmila was assigned to a new role. She would become a propagandist, a public spokeswoman for the Red Army and the Soviet war effort. Her combat days were over, but her service to her country was not. Instead of bullets, she would now use words. In late summer 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, along with 2 male Soviet delegates, embarked on an extraordinary journey to the West. The Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of the war against Nazi Germany, suffering catastrophic casualties, while the Western Allies prepared for eventual operations against occupied Europe. Stalin and the Soviet leadership were desperate for the Americans and British to open a second front in Western Europe, which would divert German forces and relieve pressure on the Red Army. Lyudmila's mission was to tour the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, speaking to audiences about the war, about Soviet resistance, and about the urgent need for the Second Front. On August 27, 1942, the Soviet delegation arrived in Washington, D.C., where they were greeted by Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States. Lyudmila Pavlichenko became the first Soviet citizen to be received as a guest of the White House. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with her personally, speaking with her first among the delegates, like a true gentleman, as she later recalled. He asked her about her combat experiences, about the battles she had fought, about the medals she had received. When she raised the issue of the Second Front, the president was diplomatic but non-committal, suggesting that the British were the obstacle to American action, but assuring her that the American people supported their Russian allies in their hearts and souls. The Second Front, he promised, would come in due time. In reality, Allied planning for the invasion of France was already underway, but it would not be launched until June 1944, 2 years away. Eleanor Roosevelt took a particular interest in Lyudmila, and the 2 women formed an unlikely friendship. The First Lady invited Lyudmila to tour the United States, and often accompanied her to speaking engagements, using her considerable influence to secure high-level meetings and large audiences. For Lyudmila, the American tour was a shock and a frustration. She had come from the apocalyptic nightmare of the Eastern Front, where entire cities were being obliterated and millions were dying, to a country that was at war but where civilian life continued with relative normalcy. The contrast was jarring, and the American press seemed far more interested in her appearance and her femininity than in her message. At press conferences and interviews, American journalists, particularly women reporters, asked her questions that left her stunned and angry. Did she use powder and rouge? Did she curl her hair? Did she polish her nails? One reporter criticized the length of her military uniform skirt, suggesting that in America women wore shorter skirts and besides, her uniform made her look fat. Lyudmila was incredulous. "I am amazed at the kind of questions put to me by the women press correspondents in Washington," she said in a Time magazine interview in 1942. "Don't they know there is a war? They asked me silly questions such as do I use powder and rouge and nail polish? And do I curl my hair?" She had killed 309 enemy soldiers in combat, had survived 2 of the most brutal sieges of the war, and American reporters wanted to discuss makeup and fashion. But Lyudmila learned to fight on this new front as well. She studied the American press, learned how to handle their questions with wit and directness, how to turn their superficial questions into opportunities to discuss the real issues: the Nazi invasion, Soviet suffering, the need for Allied action. At a speaking engagement in Chicago, she famously confronted the sexist questioning head-on. "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now," she declared. "Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The crowd erupted in applause and support. It was a masterful rebuke, simultaneously challenging American masculinity, highlighting Soviet sacrifice, and demanding action. The line was repeated in newspapers across the country. Lyudmila traveled extensively through the United States: Washington, New York, Chicago, Detroit, Minneapolis, Denver, Seattle, through California and back east. She spoke at rallies, factories, universities, anywhere people would gather to listen. She described the war as she had experienced it: the brutality of the fighting, the suffering of Soviet civilians, the determination of the Red Army to resist regardless of cost. She spoke about gender equality in the Soviet Union, where women were honored not just as women but as individual personalities and human beings. She also traveled to Canada and then to the United Kingdom, where she received a Colt semi-automatic pistol from the Americans and a Winchester rifle from the Canadians. The gifts were symbolic, recognition of her marksmanship and her service. But what she truly wanted was not rifles or applause, but a second front, and that she could not yet have. Before her American tour concluded, Eleanor Roosevelt invited the Soviet delegates to Hyde Park, the Roosevelt family estate in New York. The friendship between Eleanor and Lyudmila deepened during this visit. Eleanor later wrote of Lyudmila, "There is something very charming to me about the young Russian woman, Junior Lieutenant Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She has suffered, and is suffering something which is universal and binds all the world together regardless of language." The two women would maintain their friendship for years after the war, exchanging letters and eventually visiting each other again. When Lyudmila returned to the Soviet Union in late 1942, she was promoted to the rank of major and assigned to train new snipers for the Red Army. For the remainder of the war, she passed on her knowledge and experience to the next generation of Soviet marksmen, teaching them the skills and tactics that had kept her alive and made her so deadly. In 1943, she was awarded the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military decoration the country could bestow. She was one of only 500 female snipers to survive the war out of the 2,000 who had served, and the only one to receive the Hero of the Soviet Union award while still alive. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. The Soviet Union had paid an unimaginable price for victory. More than 27 million dead, countless millions more wounded, entire cities reduced to rubble, an entire generation scarred by trauma. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had survived, but survival came with its own burdens. After the war, she was reassigned as a senior researcher for the Soviet Navy, working in relative obscurity. She completed her education and became a historian, the profession she had dreamed of pursuing before the war interrupted everything. She married again, but by some accounts, she never fully recovered from the depression that followed Alexei Kitsenko's death. She carried the weight of those 309 kills, those 309 lives ended by her hand, for the rest of her life. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died on October 10, 1974, at the age of 58, from a stroke. She was buried in Moscow with full military honors. In the decades since her death, her story has been told and retold, sometimes romanticized, sometimes sensationalized, but always compelling. She has been the subject of books, films, documentaries, and countless articles. In 2015, a Russian-Ukrainian biographical film titled Battle for Sevastopol dramatized her life and service. She has become an icon, a symbol of female empowerment, Soviet resistance, and the horrors and heroism of the Second World War. But beyond the legend, beyond the statistics and the propaganda, there was a human being. A young woman who loved history and shooting, who had a son she worried about, who married twice and was widowed twice, who endured unimaginable stress and horror, who killed 309 people and lived with that knowledge every day for the rest of her life. The Germans who mocked her as a girl sniper learned the cost of their arrogance. The 309 soldiers she killed never returned home. The Soviet Union survived, in part because of people like her, who fought with a desperation and determination that the aggressor nations could not match. What lessons can we draw from Lyudmila Pavlichenko's story? There is the obvious one, the one that she herself demonstrated so clearly, that women are capable of the same courage, skill, and dedication in combat as men, and that underestimating them is a fatal mistake. The Soviet Union, whatever its many flaws and brutalities, utilized women in combat roles to a degree that no other nation in World War II matched, and those women proved their worth repeatedly. There is also a darker lesson about the costs of war, the way it takes ordinary people, students, factory workers, mothers and fathers, and transforms them into killers, forcing them to do things that violate their fundamental humanity in the name of survival and duty. Lyudmila Pavlichenko did not want to be a sniper. She wanted to be a historian. But when her country and her people faced annihilation, she picked up a rifle and did what needed to be done. That she did it with such extraordinary effectiveness is remarkable. That she survived with any humanity intact is perhaps miraculous. There is also a lesson about propaganda and perception. During her American tour, Lyudmila was simultaneously a symbol of Soviet strength and a source of discomfort for American audiences who were not accustomed to women in combat roles. The patronizing questions from reporters, the focus on her appearance rather than her achievements, revealed deep-seated assumptions about gender roles that persisted even in the face of her obvious competence and courage. Her sharp responses, particularly the famous line in Chicago about men hiding behind her back, challenged those assumptions directly. But it's worth noting that after the war, the Soviet Union itself relegated women veterans like Lyudmila to secondary roles, emphasizing traditional femininity and motherhood over military service. The women who had fought so fiercely were expected to return quietly to domestic life, their wartime contributions acknowledged but not celebrated in ways that might challenge post-war gender norms. What if history had unfolded differently? What if Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union, or if the German invasion had succeeded in capturing Moscow and forcing Soviet surrender in 1941 or 1942? Lyudmila Pavlichenko would have remained an unknown history student in Kiev. Those 309 soldiers would have lived, but millions of others would have died in a Nazi-dominated Europe. The Soviet women snipers, including the 1,500 who did not survive the war, would never have had the chance to prove their courage and skill. The story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko is, in many ways, a story that should never have needed to happen, a testament to human capability born from human catastrophe. In the end, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's legacy is complex and multifaceted. She was a deadly sniper, one of the most effective in military history, responsible for ending 309 lives. She was a symbol of Soviet propaganda, paraded before Western audiences to drum up support for the Second Front. She was a feminist icon, demonstrating female competence in a male-dominated field. She was a traumatized veteran, carrying psychological scars that never fully healed. She was a friend to Eleanor Roosevelt, bridging ideological divides through personal connection. She was a mother, a student, a historian, a soldier. She was all of these things, and reducing her to any single identity does her a disservice. Perhaps the most important thing to remember about Lyudmila Pavlichenko is that she was not superhuman, not some larger-than-life figure immune to fear or doubt. She was an ordinary person who responded to extraordinary circumstances with courage and determination. She made choices to volunteer, to fight, to kill, to survive, that most of us will never have to make. She paid a price for those choices that lasted the rest of her life. And in doing so, she helped turn the tide of the most destructive war in human history, ensuring that her son, her family, her people, and millions of others had a future beyond Nazi tyranny. That is the story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the girl sniper who became Lady Death, who never lost a duel, who killed 309 enemy soldiers, and who lived to see peace, however haunted that peace may have been.